My name is Lena Martinez, and I was 22 years old when I discovered my father had secretly arranged my marriage to a man nearly twice my age. A man whose two previous wives had died under circumstances that were never fully explained, and I was supposed to be the third, another name on his list. Another silent disappearance swept under the rug in the name of tradition and pride. It happened on a Friday afternoon, the kind of day where nothing felt off. Nothing felt dangerous, and yet everything shifted the moment I stepped into my father's home office to leave my younger brother's school papers on his desk. Something I had done many times before. Except this time I noticed a file half open with my name typed on the cover, along with the words, "Private marriage arrangement," and curiosity led me to flip it open despite the fear curling in my gut. That's when I saw the name that would change everything. James Carter, a man I remembered from a local crime story years ago, a man whose first wife drowned in a bathtub and whose second wife died of blunt force trauma to the head. Both deaths ruled as accidents or undetermined causes. Both cases closed without conviction due to lack of evidence. And now he was about to become my husband, chosen by my father without my knowledge or consent. I stood there in shock as I scanned the emails, the draft of the wedding announcement, the scheduled date for the ceremony just 8 weeks away. My name printed neatly next to his, and the reality that this wasn't just some old-fashioned matchmaking, but a carefully constructed plan that involved legal paperwork, religious leaders, and money. Lots of money, all orchestrated without ever asking me if I wanted this life, this man, this fate. At first, I thought it was some kind of mistake or cruel joke, but when I confronted my mother that evening, her silence gave me the answer I wasn't ready to hear. She stood motionless in the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped the same counter for the 5th time in a row before finally whispering, "It's already done. Your father believes this is what's best." And in that moment, I realized that no one in that house would stand up for me, not even the woman who gave birth to me. I asked her if she knew who James Carter really was, if she remembered the stories, if she had read the articles about the women he had married and buried, and all she said was, "That was in the past. People change. He's successful now, he has resources," and something inside me cracked, not out of fear, but out of fury, the kind that comes from knowing the people who should protect you have instead decided to offer you like livestock to someone they wouldn't trust alone with a dog. Let me backtrack for a moment so you understand how this even became possible. I was born and raised in the South Side of Chicago, in a tight-knit Latino community where loyalty to family often outweighed logic, love, or law. And in our household, my father, Carlos Martinez, was both king and warden, a man who built a moderately successful construction business and carried himself like a patriarch from another century, proud, unyielding, and obsessed with control. My mother Maria stayed home, played the role of the perfect wife, cooked for every church fundraiser, dressed modestly, and rarely raised her voice unless it was to defend my father's decisions, even when they hurt us, even when they were wrong, because in her eyes, obedience was strength and silence was safety. As the oldest daughter, I learned early on that love came with conditions and that respect was measured by how well you could disappear when needed, how easily you could pretend to agree, how long you could survive without showing your scars, and so I became good at surviving. Not living, just surviving. I went to school, got decent grades, worked part-time to help pay bills, and eventually found a job as a social worker assistant focused on child protection, helping other girls escape situations not unlike mine without ever admitting that I too was waiting for the moment I could run. My plan was to save enough money to move out before applying for graduate school, maybe pursue a master's in social work or public policy, and finally rent a small apartment where I could sleep without locking my bedroom door, without jumping at the sound of my father's footsteps down the hallway, without calculating every word before I opened my mouth at dinner. But plans mean nothing in houses ruled by fear, and now I had 8 weeks to figure out how to either disappear or destroy everything my father had built around me. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sound of the pipes clicking in the walls, and imagining myself in a white dress beside a man whose hands had once held down 2 other women before they stopped breathing. And I knew then that I would not survive this marriage. Maybe not physically, maybe not right away, but something in me would die the moment I said I do, and I wasn't ready to bury myself for the sake of family honor. The next morning, I acted normal. I went to work, answered emails, made phone calls, helped a young girl get into emergency foster care after her stepfather threatened her, and the irony was not lost on me. I was fighting for strangers to have freedom while losing my own behind closed doors. That day, during my lunch break, I called Ms. Riley, my old high school history teacher who had once helped me apply for college behind my father's back. She was one of the few people I trusted, and I needed advice, not just moral support, but legal direction. We met at a coffee shop near her campus office, and when I showed her the photos I had taken of the documents, her face turned pale. She grabbed my hand and said, "Lena, this is serious. You need to report this," but I told her I couldn't not yet, because if I did, and it didn't work, I'd lose my job, my home, and maybe my life. She listened carefully, asked me to forward all the files, and gave me a burner phone, said she'd start talking to some legal contacts in case things escalated, and I walked out of that cafe not feeling safer, but feeling like at least I wasn't alone anymore. That night, my father didn't say anything about the file, which told me one of two things. Either he didn't know I had seen it, or he was waiting for the right moment to confront me, and I needed to be ready for both. I spent the next few days pretending everything was fine, while slowly gathering anything that might help me later. I copied every email, every document, every appointment logged into his calendar that mentioned James Carter, and I saved them to a hidden drive inside an old calculator I kept in my backpack. It wasn't high-tech, but it was quiet and invisible, and I had learned to survive by being both. I first met James Carter the following Sunday not by choice, but because my father insisted on it and framed the meeting as a family lunch to honor a new business partner. I knew better than to argue, especially since I still had no proof that he knew I had seen the file, so I dressed modestly, kept my face calm, and drove myself to the restaurant, a small upscale Mexican place my family frequented on holidays, the kind of place with white tablecloths and waiters who smiled too hard. James was already there when I arrived, sitting next to my father, his hands folded neatly on the table, a glass of water in front of him untouched. He stood to greet me, extended his hand, and I shook it because refusing would have given me away. His grip was firm but cold, and he smiled with perfect politeness, but there was something about his eyes that made my stomach twist, something hollow, like a man who had rehearsed emotions so often he no longer knew which ones were real. He asked me about my work, and I answered carefully, watching his expression, as I mentioned child protection, wondering if the irony registered, but it didn't, or if it did, he was too good at hiding it. Throughout lunch, my father boasted about his business, his reputation in the community, and how James and he were planning to collaborate on a housing project for low-income families, something I knew was a cover, a way to present their connection as financial, not personal. My mother barely spoke, only smiled occasionally, and offered dishes like a hostess, not a mother who was about to marry off her daughter. At one point, James leaned in and said quietly, "Your father tells me you're strong-willed." I like that it keeps things interesting, and I had to force a laugh, not because it was funny, but because I needed to get through this without raising alarms. When the check came, my father insisted on paying, and as we stood to leave, James handed me a small card with his number and said, "If you ever want to talk without the crowd, call me directly," and in that moment, I felt every nerve in my body scream. I took the card, smiled politely, and walked out of that restaurant, knowing that I was running out of time. That night, I went back to the documents, reviewed every detail again, looking for anything I might have missed, any evidence that could be used legally, anything that connected James's past wives to suspicious deaths. I found news clippings, old blog posts, an archived interview with a neighbor who once reported screams coming from James's second home at 2 in the morning, but no charges had been filed. The pattern was there, the bodies were real, but the law had failed both women, and now it was circling back to me. I sent all my findings to Ms. Riley, who replied with a short message. "This is enough to start, but not enough to win. Keep going." So I kept going. Over the next 2 weeks, I created a backup email under a fake name and began reaching out to online support groups for survivors of coerced marriage and domestic abuse. I spoke to 3 women who said they had known James years ago. One of them had dated him briefly, said he was charming at first, but became possessive within days, following her to work, demanding she wear certain clothes, punishing her with silence if she disagreed with him. She ended things after 3 weeks and moved cities. I asked her if she would be willing to talk to someone legally, and she hesitated, then agreed on the condition of anonymity. During this time, my father grew colder, more rigid in his routines, more watchful of my behavior, like he sensed something shifting. He asked to see my phone, said it was for a software update, but I refused, saying work policy restricted personal sharing of child welfare cases, and he backed off, but I could see the suspicion behind his smile. My mother stopped speaking to me unless it was necessary, and my little brother, who was too young to understand what was happening, just looked confused whenever the air in the house turned thick with silence. I began sleeping with my shoes on a backpack of essentials hidden under my bed, a burner phone in my jacket pocket, and a USB drive taped inside the lining of my shoe. One night, while reviewing more documents, I came across something I had overlooked before: a scanned letter addressed to my father from a man named Vincent Carter James's cousin. The letter referenced a prior incident in 2010 involving Emily and mentioned a settlement paid quietly to avoid press. Emily wasn't listed as one of James's wives in any public record, but I searched harder and found a missing persons report filed that same year in another state. A young woman named Emily Carter, aged 19, last seen leaving her job at a hardware store. No body was ever found, and the case went cold. I printed the report, sent it to Ms. Riley, and asked if she could track down any connection. She replied the next day with a name: Patricia Summers, the woman who had filed the missing person report, Emily's sister. Ms. Riley managed to get a contact number, and after 2 days of hesitation, I called. Patricia sounded tired, her voice hoarse, like someone who had been speaking truths no one wanted to hear. I told her who I was, what was happening, and she went silent for a long time. Then she said, "He tried to do the same to my sister, but we weren't fast enough. I can't prove it, but I know in my bones he did something to her. If you're trying to stop him, I'll help you." With Patricia now involved, I felt momentum building, like the wall around this man was starting to crack. She sent me scanned letters, hospital records, showing her sister had visited the ER twice in the month before she vanished both times for bruises and fractures that were labeled as falls. She sent me photos, one of which showed James and Emily together at a family barbecue. His hand gripped tightly around her wrist, smiling for the camera like nothing was wrong. I forwarded everything to Ms. Riley, who said, "This changes everything." That week, I stopped pretending. At dinner, when my father began talking about scheduling the wedding for mid-April, I interrupted and said calmly, "I won't be there," and the look he gave me was the kind that made your skin go cold. My mother dropped her fork, and for a moment no one spoke. Then he said, "You've been talking to someone, haven't you?" And I didn't answer. He stood up, walked around to the table, and stared at me like I was a stranger. "You're acting like a child," he said. "This is not about you. This is about our family, our name, our legacy." And I replied, "Then take my name off it, because I don't want to be part of your legacy." That night, I packed my things, the essentials at least, and texted Ms. Riley. She said I could come stay with her for a few days while we sorted the legal options. I waited until 3 in the morning when the house was quiet, slipped out through the side door, and walked 5 blocks to where she was parked. When I got in the car, she didn't say anything, just reached over and locked the doors. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I just sat there in the passenger seat, holding the only thing I had left: my truth and the documents that proved it. The next morning started quietly. Ms. Riley made us coffee and set up her living room with legal pads, a laptop, and all the printouts I had collected. She called one of her contacts, a retired legal advocate named Jenna, who used to work in family law, and explained the situation briefly. Within an hour, Jenna arrived at the house with a thick folder and a voice that made you listen. She didn't waste time. After reviewing the documents, she nodded and said, "This isn't just coercion. This borders on conspiracy to commit marriage fraud, potentially linked to historical abuse and concealment of criminal acts." It felt strange hearing my story reframed in legal terms, but also strangely empowering. Jenna asked if I would be willing to make a statement under oath. I said yes, not because I wasn't scared, but because silence had already cost too much. We drove to a legal center across town that partnered with survivor networks and filed for a protective order. It was temporary, but it gave me something solid: a paper shield that at least recognized what I had been through. That afternoon, my phone began to ring. First my mother, then my father, then James. I didn't answer, but the voicemails came in anyway, some pleading, some angry, some cold and scripted, like they had been rehearsed. I handed the phone to Jenna, who documented each call. By evening, Miss Riley's neighborhood felt unfamiliar. Cars parked longer than usual. A man walking past the house twice in 10 minutes. Jenna decided we should move that night. We left just before 10. I took only a backpack. Jenna drove us to a secure location owned by an advocacy group's small apartment space with reinforced doors, panic buttons, and an unlisted address. I finally exhaled. For the first time in weeks, I was in a place where no one knew me. No one expected me to smile, and no one could drag me back. 2 days later, Patricia arrived in person. She had driven overnight to deliver something she didn't want to send by mail. A notebook old and frayed, filled with her sister Emily's writing. Inside were detailed accounts of conversations, threats, hospital visits, and a letter Emily had never sent, a letter addressed to their parents describing what James had done. It was emotional, heartbreaking, and devastatingly clear. Patricia looked at me and said I couldn't save her. But I can help save you. With that notebook, the case shifted. Jenna contacted a journalist she knew from her time in court reporting. We didn't go public yet, but we began compiling the story, every detail, every document, every voice that had been ignored for too long. Jenna submitted an official complaint to the district attorney's office. Ms. Riley worked to secure affidavits from the women I had spoken to earlier, and I prepared myself for what would come next. We got the court date 3 weeks later. It wasn't for the wedding, it was to argue the enforcement of the protective order and to determine whether further action should be taken against my father and James for conspiracy and endangerment. I arrived at the courthouse flanked by Jenna and Patricia. My hands were steady, but my heart beat like a drum. Inside, my father sat tall and expressionless. My mother wore a veil that covered most of her face. James didn't show up in person, but his lawyer did, a man in an expensive gray suit who called the accusations misguided, emotionally charged, and lacking substance. But Jenna countered with documentation. She showed the court the timeline of emails, the arrangement paperwork, the meeting notes, and most importantly, Emily's notebook. She didn't read it aloud, she simply handed it to the judge and let the silence stretch long enough to make everyone in the room uncomfortable. When it was my turn to speak, I stood without trembling. I described the night I found the file, the lunch with James, the warnings from strangers, and the cold plan my father had tried to pass as care. I spoke clearly without bitterness. I wasn't there to cry. I was there to tell the truth. Then Patricia was called. She testified about her sister's disappearance, the silence that followed, and the years she spent screaming into a void. Her voice cracked only once when she said if someone had believed us back then, maybe Emily would be alive today. The judge sat quiet for a long time. Then she said, "The court finds sufficient cause to extend the protective order indefinitely. Furthermore, this case shall be referred to the district attorney for review of potential charges related to coercion, conspiracy, and obstruction. It wasn't a full conviction, but it was a public acknowledgement. It was validation." Outside the courtroom, I walked past my father without a word. He didn't look at me. My mother did, but her eyes were empty. There was no apology, no regret, just distance. That night back at the shelter, I sat with Patricia and Ms. Riley. We didn't celebrate. There wasn't champagne or applause. Just tea and quiet. Patricia handed me a small photo of Emily smiling in the sun. "This is why we do it," she said, "so the next girl doesn't have to live afraid." The days that followed the court ruling felt like walking through ruins, everything still standing yet broken in some invisible way. My father didn't come near me, but word spread quickly through our community. Some neighbors refused to make eye contact when I passed by. Others sent anonymous messages calling me a disgrace, a liar, a traitor. They didn't ask for the truth. They just wanted me quiet. But for every door that closed, another opened. The advocacy group offered to let me stay longer, and Ms. Riley helped me enroll in night classes for public policy. I started volunteering at a support line for women facing forced marriage or familial abuse. One evening, I got a call from a girl just 17 whispering into the phone from her bedroom while her parents planned a wedding she didn't want. She asked if it was true if I had gotten out if people had actually listened. I told her yes, and that I would help her too. Then something happened that I didn't expect. Patricia called late one night and said I found her. She meant Emily, her sister. The body had finally been discovered during a construction project on abandoned farmland in Kentucky near where James's company had operated years ago. The discovery was painful, but also brought closure. Emily's name could finally be placed where it belonged in a record that mattered. At Emily's memorial, I met 3 other women who had once dated James. One had been threatened, another nearly married him. The third said she'd been followed for months after breaking it off. They all cried as they spoke her name, not just for Emily, but for the version of themselves that could have been her. That day, I decided to go public. I worked with a journalist from a nonprofit publication, the same one Jenna had contacted months ago. The article featured no real names, no faces, only stories and verified facts. It described the system that allowed forced marriages to exist in silence, how family honor was often used as a weapon, and how the law was slow to protect unless someone bled. The story went viral. Emails came in from across the country. Women, mothers, teachers, and even retired social workers wrote to say they had seen these patterns but didn't know what they were called. Girls who had escaped wrote to thank me. A few asked how they could help others. One girl from Texas said I thought it was just me. We began organizing under a new name, the Emily Network. It started with just 10 volunteers and a spreadsheet, but soon we had a working phone line, legal partners, safe houses, and translated guides for families from over 20 backgrounds. I wrote the first handbook on how to spot early signs of coercion, how to document abuse quietly, and how to escape without burning every bridge. We distributed it to counselors' shelters and even police stations. The backlash, of course, returned. My father tried to sue for defamation, claiming the article cost him business and destroyed his reputation. His lawyer spoke loudly about family values and tradition, but no court entertained the claim. The judge simply said, "There is no defamation in truth." That was the last time I saw my father in person. Then came the letter, a handwritten note from my mother. No apology, just a single sentence. "You were always too strong for us." I didn't reply. I burned it that night. Months passed, then a year. I moved into my own apartment, small but safe. I began speaking at universities and advocacy conferences not as a survivor, but as a woman who refused to vanish. My voice shook the first few times, but each word landed heavier than the last. One day, a girl arrived at our office. She was young, quiet, and bruised. She handed me a notebook just like Patricia had done for me. Inside were names, dates, addresses, and a plan. She had done her homework. She had saved herself. And when I asked her why she came to us, she said, "I read about you. You made it sound possible." That evening, I stood alone in the hallway of our small center and cried, not because I was sad, but because I realized something. This was no longer about me. It was about her, and the next girl, and the one after that. The world didn't change overnight, but it had begun to shift. There are still days I wake up in a cold sweat, still nights where I hear James's voice in my dreams, still moments when I flinch at the sound of my father's name. But I don't let it stop me, because I'm still here. And so are the girls who came after me. When I was a little girl, I thought love meant obedience. I thought being good meant staying quiet. I thought family was supposed to protect you even when it hurt. But now I know better. Family is not who controls you. It's who stands beside you. Love is not something forced behind locked doors. It is something chosen, something shared, something free. To the women who came before me and never got the chance to speak to the Emilys of the world, whose names were erased, I carry your memory in every step I take. And to the girls still trapped behind expectations and silence, I say this: you are not alone. There is help. There are laws. There are people who believe you. And there is a future waiting for you that does not involve fear or control. You can say no, you can run, you can survive, and more than that, you can rebuild. For the women over 50 listening, your voices still matter. Your wisdom still counts. You have daughters, nieces, granddaughters who need you not to look away. This is not just a young woman's fight. It's a human one. Silence never protected anyone, but truth, even when whispered, can move mountains. So whisper it, shout it, write it down, pass it on. Let them know we are not afraid. Not anymore.